arises out of unicellular consciousness is really fundamentally a kind of insectoid consciousness. Now you could look at insectoid consciousness even in white blood cells and macrophages, where they're starting to become much more active, much less passive, really, not just floating around in an ocean of nutrients, but actually taking on more activity. Right? So that stage of consciousness, the insectoid consciousness, is actually kind of represented in human sexual functioning to some extent. So this is going to sound weird, but I got to say it. If you've ever watched pornography, you'll notice that it's actually rather like watching a National Geographic show about insects reproducing. It's not that different. There's a certain kind of equality of experience and exchange there, actually. I know we make a great deal about it, and we attach flowers and Valentine's Day. The actual mechanics of sex are fairly insectoid, fundamentally. Insectoid consciousness represents the more primitive aspects of our nervous system, obviously, because it has to do with well, let's go back to the evolutionary stages of the human embryo's development, right? So we're floating down into the ampulla, and then the zygote is attaching to the posterior wall, typically, of the uterus, which is significant because it's attaching to the posterior wall of the uterus in relation to the mother's Mingmen, which is her energy gate, called the gate of destiny on the spine. So the zygote attaches, and at this point, as the zygote's attaching, remember, it's just like 40, 50, 60 identical sister cells, blastomeres. No differentiation. We're still in unicellular consciousness. When it attaches, it forms something called a syncytial trophoblast, which is this spreading out tissue that merges with the endometrial tissue of the mother. And so there's a merging process that takes place between mother and mother's tissue and between the emerging embryo out of the zygote. And as that takes place, the cells inside the zygote polarize. Instead of becoming all identical, some of them form what's called the inner cell mass, and some of them form the trophoblastic layer. And then in the middle is a little space that fills up with fluid, the blastocystic cavity. Okay? That's a polarization. That's a giant, boom, polar shift in structural organization, and I would argue a shift in consciousness. If you're actually in a state of bliss when you're a little, zygote and you're floating down into the womb, this shift into the inner cell mass is actually a contraction into bodily identified consciousness. Now I'm going to suggest that unicellular consciousness is not really bodily identified, it's bodily connected, but it's not identified with the body. Once you start forming the inner cell mass in the syncytial trophoblast, there's a shift in the process of consciousness that looks like body identification. It doesn't yet have human emotions of any kind in it, right? It's the only layer of emotion that emerges once you get actual body identification is a kind of irritation, a kind of yearning to get back to some state of comfort. So this level of consciousness is where the unicellular awareness is starting to move towards a more insectoid type of consciousness. Now, an insect doesn't actually feel fear. And doesn't feel any of the higher emotions. People who've studied the theory of emotions say that fear is really the most primary emotion. It's so primary that some people say it's not really an emotion. It's more of just a sort of neurological set of reflexes. And other people, like humans, would argue that, no, actually, fear is distinctly an emotion, as well as a bunch of neurological reflexes. In my understanding of insect consciousness, insects don't actually feel even fear yet. What insects are conscious of is if their body is not happy, is being damaged in some way. They have a reaction to that. They have a mental reaction to that. But it's a kind of irritation. Now, I'm not arguing that you should go home and start pulling the wings off flies to observe their emotional response to this. I already did that experiment when I was 6 years old, and I got very clear answers about that. Please don't repeat it. But it's an interesting kind of shift. So that insectoid consciousness has overlap with the kind of consciousness that's reflected in creatures with exoskeletons. Now, obviously, insects have a hard, bony, well, not exactly bony, but it's more like chitin, but it's this hard exoskeleton. And we also know that crustaceans have a hard exoskeleton. Crabs and shrimps and shellfish and those kind of creatures. And as that exoskeleton develops, and as we move more towards the next stage of evolutionary development, it would be the stage of evolutionary development that I would call reptilian. Or even, it could be Piscean, it could be like a fish stage of development. When you move into that next stage of evolutionary development, you actually start to get the development of fear as an emotional state. The body is, the self, the consciousness is identified with the body, as it is in the insectoid stage, but now there's another layer to that identification. There's an actual emotional quality of fear when the body is threatened. And as we're going up the spine, we're moving from unicellular consciousness at the base of the spine and around the tailbone and the inside of the sacrum to this kind of insectoid and then crustacean and then Piscean consciousness as we move through the sacrum up towards the lumbar spine. Now, the Chinese always recognized the interrelationship between this stage of consciousness and the sacrum and the lumbar spine. Now, we know that the lumbar spine, from a Chinese medical point of view, is ruled by the kidneys. Now, this is an interesting statement, because technically, the kidneys are kind of up a little bit, right? Technically, anatomically, your kidneys are located underneath your 12th rib, maybe underneath your 11th rib, and below, going down towards L1. They're not like located right in the middle of your lumbar spine. But they rule the lumbar spine, and the kidneys rule the processes of water in the body. And water is the element associated with the development of fear. And it's also understood in Chinese medicine that the kidneys rule fear. And what is fear? Fear is just that you identify as your body from a place of consciousness. Your consciousness says, I am the body. And then it has a whole set of emotional reactions around your body being threatened.